Request for intervention, pattern of retaliation and failure of protection. I place the Government of Canada on formal notice of a sustained pattern of institutional failure resulting in repeated displacement, exposure to harm, and retaliatory criminalization while I have had active complaints before federal and provincial bodies. This is not a complaint about a disagreement with public policy. It is a record of failure to protect, procedural obstruction, and foreseeable harm occurring while the state continued to rely on my compliance, disclosure, and restraint. Between 2017 and the present, I have experienced retaliation following protected disclosures and complaints, repeated housing displacements, 4 threats and 3 forced displacements without my consent during active proceedings, failure to restrain known abusive actors with evidence despite notice and publicly made videos of them running me over with their car or harassing me or threatening me. Failure to restrain known abusive actors. This isn't speculation. Weaponization of procedural limits, page caps, jurisdictional reflection, and delay. Escalation from civil matters into criminal exposure. At multiple points, I sought lawful remedies, not confrontation. Each attempt coincided with increased instability rather than protection. By October 5th, 2021, following a serious housing incident that directly threatened my health and safety, in London, Ontario, I concluded that remaining in Canada without protection posed a risk to my life and safety. I therefore pursued lawful exit and medical relocation, not avoidance of responsibility, not that I did anything wrong at any point, by suing the government. However, I was labeled an extremist for filing lawsuits against the Trudeau government. This submission series will document in sequence how state inaction and administrative fragmentation produce predictable harm and how intervention remains necessary and within your duties to act. This is a request for oversight and correction, not sympathy. Part 2. We'll look at employment, reliance, and early retaliation in 2018 by the Stantec and government actors. Part 2. Federal reliance, accommodation failures, and foreseeable retaliation through employment at Stantec Consulting in Ottawa, Ontario, while producing work for the government as a Level 2 security cleared employee in landscape architecture and community development, working on Parliament Hill and even Harrington Lake, his property, when Trudeau updated that property. This submission addresses the front end of this pattern, how federal and institutional reliance on my compliance and disclosures coexisted with failures to protect me when those same disclosures created vulnerability. I am a trained professional, landscape architecture, very well documented, lots of skills, and previous experience in corporate finance in fraud, risk, and recovery. Now, how federal and institutional reliance on my compliance and disclosures coexisted, and when I was employed in contexts requiring reliability and responsibility, my record is not one of impulsive conflict seeking. It is one of repeated attempts to use lawful channels to correct harm. The core issue is this. When I disclosed vulnerabilities and sought accommodation or protection, the system responded with avoidance, narrowing, and delay, while continuing to benefit from my restraint and compliance. That imbalance is not neutral. It is an incentive structure that rewards institutional inaction, abuse, and punishes the person for reporting harm. My key points for oversight. My disclosure were not treated as triggers for protection. They became leverage points for exclusion. Complaints were redirected, fragmented, or stalled across bodies, producing no one responsible outcomes. Practical remedies were replaced by procedural containment, format limits, jurisdictional ping-pong, and delay. Each delay increased foreseeable risk, housing insecurity, loss of income, and exposure to predatory actors. This is not a request for special treatment. It is a request for the government to recognize that failure to act after notice is action by consequence, especially where predictable harm results. The next submission will link this institutional pattern to housing displacement, witness evidence, and retaliatory criminalization. Submission to the Prime Minister, Part 3 of 10. Housing violence, failure to intervene, and forced displacement in London, Ontario. This submission addresses the housing phase of the pattern and the Government of Canada's failure to intervene or coordinate protection when serious safety concerns were repeatedly brought forward between 2019 and 2021. While I had active complaints and sought lawful remedies, I experienced escalating housing-related harm in London, Ontario. These included persistent interference with my income, my home, my intimidation, and safety incidents that went beyond ordinary landlord and tenant conflict. By October 5th, 2021, a high-risk incident occurred involving the use of a vehicle as a weapon in a manner that directly placed me in fear of serious bodily harm or death. This incident was not isolated. It followed a prolonged period of reported interference and intimidation and hate crimes. Despite notice to authorities and ongoing proceedings, no effective protective action was taken. The result was predictable: continued exposure to harm, deterioration of stability, and the collapse of any reasonable expectation that domestic remedies would restrain the conduct. It is critical to emphasize that this was not a breakdown of private relations alone. It was the outcome of a system that received notice of escalating risk, failed to act in a coordinated or timely manner, and allowed procedural fragmentation to substitute for protection. This failure directly contributed to my decision to seek safety through relocation rather than remain in an environment where harm was foreseeable and unaddressed. The next submission will address the steps I took lawfully to leave Canada and the institutional barriers that prevented that exit. Part 4. Lawful Exit Plan, Medical Relocation to Portugal, and Federal Obstruction. This submission addresses my lawful plan to leave Canada to preserve my safety and stability and the barriers imposed by federal transport entry policies despite documented medical rationale and clear receiving country requirements. Following prolonged unaddressed harm and repeated procedural dead ends, I pursued a structured relocation plan to Portugal in late 2021. This was not impulsive travel. It involved concrete steps arranging international shipping of my possessions, coordinated accommodation and entry requirements, and securing professional clinical contact in Portugal for autism-related care. Portugal's authorities confirmed entry requirements that were manageable, testing-based, and my care pathway in Lisbon was organized in advance. Nonetheless, I was prevented from boarding and effectively immobilized inside Canada. That immobilization occurred while I was seeking lawful remedies and while clear documentary notice was being provided to multiple institutions. The public interest problem here is not my personal inconvenience. It is the governmental consequence of fragmented systems where a person with documented vulnerability, active proceedings, and clear medical rationale is blocked from lawful exit and then forced back into the same unprotected environment that precipitated the exit plan. Key points for oversight. My relocation was organized and evidence-backed, not reckless. The receiving country's entry requirements were not the barrier. Portugal said I had no issues coming. I agreed to being quarantined during the pandemic, and I was following all of the tests, and I had my negative test before boarding. Federal level immobilization predictability intensified risk and instability. Administrative delay and procedural deflection functioned as a denial of protection. The next submission will address the formal record trail of my expression of interest Dear Portugal letter and proof it was distributed into active proceedings, HRTO, and other bodies, establishing contemporaneous notice. Now, other than TikTok accepting money from the government to silence voices, explain to me why a government or a platform would want to silence someone's voice writing a letter to the Prime Minister on Christmas Eve regarding ongoing unstoppable harm and trying to prevent harm. What part of this message to my Prime Minister violates the ethics of TikTok and the community standards of TikTok? Please explain to me what part of this violates any ethics at all. I'd love to know. It doesn't. They're being paid to silence witnesses across this platform by Canadian government, even though they pulled out.